You are listening to David Pawson podcasts. This is a series of talks in 4 parts addressed specifically to men. When God numbered Israel, he counted the men over 20 who were able to fight. When Jesus began to build his church, he chose 12 men, most of whom worked with their hands. The New Testament letters are all addressed to brothers. Yet many churches today resemble lifeboats, saving women and children first. What went wrong? How can it be put right? Why is it easier to get women converted than men? What are the differences between men and women? Is a man's daily work a necessary evil or his full-time Christian service? How can we disciple men today? These and many other questions about the roles and responsibilities of men are answered by David Pawson under the banner Men for God. Men for God, Part 1 of 4.
For about 10 years I've been speaking at days like this and 3- and 4-day conferences like this under the title Men for God. And I want to, in this first talk, tell you where I got that burden, how I got it, why I'm doing it. Because for the first 30 years of my ministry, every meeting I spoke to was mixed. And then about 10 years ago, whenever I prayed, the one word I kept hearing from God was men, men, men. And I shared it with my wife, and she said, you must start talking to men. In fact, she said something else. She said, from now on, you mustn't refuse an invitation to speak to men, which I haven't until recently, but it's got too big a burden now to answer every invitation. But the burden took the previous 30 years to grow and to come to fruition. And I want to tell you a little about myself and my background at the beginning so that you know where I'm coming from. I think I'd better start, 60 years ago, when I gave up smoking. I gave up smoking the day that I took it up, and I've never had one since. 4 of us went into the bushes and we smoked a whole box full, and we were sick as dogs. I've yet to meet the person who enjoyed their first cigarette, but we certainly didn't enjoy our first 50. And we were sick as dogs. I was describing this in Derby City Hall recently, and a Methodist minister on the platform leapt off his seat and said, David, I was one of the other 3. And he'd forgotten all about it until that moment. Be sure your sins will find you out. Now listen, smoking won't take you to hell, but it will make you smell as if you've already been there. But why did we do it, since we didn't enjoy it? The answer is we wanted to think we were men instead of boys. Every boy has a kind of picture in his mind of what manhood is and wants to be that image. It is God's will that a boy should get his image of manhood from his father, and that every boy should say, when I grow up, I want to be like my dad. But I meet hundreds, perhaps thousands of men who say the last person I wanted to be like was my dad. And many of us react against that. So we pick up our image of manhood from all kinds of places. And my little image as a boy of 9 was smoking. Later, at the age of 16, I left school and went to work on a farm because it had always been my ambition to be a farmer, and I'd spend every holiday on farms. And so at 16, I went to work on a farm, got up at 4 in the morning to milk 90 cows with another man who had the dubious reputation of being able to swear longer than anyone else without repeating himself. And they held competitions for obscenities and blasphemies, and my vocabulary became greatly extended. Now it's interesting that once again this was part of the boyhood image. If you're going to be a man, you've got to swear. You've got to use bad language. And of course, most swear words come from the 2 sacred relationships in human life, between man and woman, and between men and God. That's why the 2 most frequently used profanities in England are fuck and hell. And they take these sacred relationships and profane them. And that is what swearing does. It's degrading something that's good, something that's even holy. And yet, it's part of the image of manhood that boys get. It's time I started swearing, and then I'm proving I'm a man. And so I grew up with an image of manhood which I picked up from all over the place. Fortunately, a year after I went farming, I met a man called Jesus, who I thought had been dead for 2,000 years. And it was a bit of a shock to find out he wasn't. I went back to the farm and found myself singing choruses to the cows at 5 o'clock in the morning. That is a minor miracle, because you don't feel like singing normally at 5 in the morning when you face that kind of task. I wish I'd taken out a patent for it, because years later in the Farmer's Weekly I discovered an article which said music helps milk flow in the cows. And at that stage many farmers used to pipe music into the cowshed to improve milk flow. Well, I can claim to have discovered that long before it was publicized. But there it was, and life began to change quite radically. I began to preach, not in churches, they wouldn't have had me then, but I would preach anywhere I could, and my pulpit was an ex-US Army Jeep left over from World War II. And I would park it anywhere there were people. If there was a queue outside a cinema or down at the beach at a place called Whitley Bay in Northumberland, anywhere, I'd park this Jeep and I'd preach. I wanted to tell the world what I'd discovered. Jesus is alive. And that's changed the whole of history. And I was so excited about it that naively I just got up anywhere and preached about it. Soon about 70 or 80 young people had joined me. And we were quite a gang in the northeast of England. Got a bit notorious. We went anywhere. Well, after a bit, I found myself preaching in churches, and it happened this way. I went to have tea one Sunday afternoon with a converted bookmaker in Durham. And I knew he was preaching that night in a chapel in a place called Spennymoor, and I went with him to hear him. And on the bus there, I said, "What are you preaching about tonight, Jack?" And he said, "I'm not preaching tonight, you are." And I got up into that pulpit and managed to get through my whole theology and my whole testimony and everything else in 7 minutes flat. A feat I've never achieved since. So, now there was a tension in my life. I loved farming, and I wanted to be a farmer, but now I found myself loving preaching and wanting to be a preacher. And so there was this tension built up. I want to share with you now a secret of a simple secret that I've worked out about this matter of guidance. Some people seem to make such a meal of getting guidance from the Lord. My arrangement with him is this: you're the Lord, therefore you're my boss. It is not my job to try and read your mind. It is your responsibility to tell me what you want me to do. And I made a solemn promise to him years ago: if you will tell me clearly what you want me to do, I'll do it. If you tell me something to say or somewhere to go, provided you tell me clearly, I'll be obedient. I think by his grace I've managed to keep that promise through the years, though it's had its cost and it's had its consequences. Nevertheless, it means that I don't search for guidance. If I don't hear anything from him, I assume he wants me to carry on doing what I was already doing. But if he wants me to do something else, he knows he's only got to tell me clearly. Now that saves an awful lot of hassle, and that's my approach to guidance for what it's worth. And I can only say that it works. Not always in the way you want it to, but it works. And so one morning I got up and I said, "Lord, will you please tell me by 12 noon today whether you want me to be a preacher or a farmer?" And at 10:30 I'm having coffee with a friend on the farm, and he looked straight at me and he said, "David, you'll finish up in a pulpit, not behind a plough." I said, "That's not clear enough, Lord." And I left him, and I went out into the road, and I bumped straight into a retired Methodist minister. And I hadn't seen him for years. I'd known him when I was a little boy, and I said, "Hello, Mr. Scott, how are you?" And he didn't tell me. But then when you say, "How are you?" you don't always expect an answer. But he said, "David, why aren't you in the ministry?" It was now 11:30. I said, that's clear enough, Lord. And so while I stayed on farming for another 3 years and took a degree in agriculture in Newcastle University, nevertheless I knew that my future was clear. Just a few weeks later, my father said, I want to talk with you, and wondered what I'd done wrong. But he said, I have arranged for you to rent a farm when you're 21. He said, I know you want to be a farmer, and I've arranged for a little farm in Scotland for you to rent as soon as you've reached 21. And I had to tell him he was just a few weeks too late, that my Heavenly Father had got in first. So that was quite something. And when I drive past that little farm, I often look at it and wonder I might still be milking cows there. And I'd love to. Put me on a tractor ploughing on a nice day with seagulls flying around, and I'm as happy as the day is long. But it meant something different. And so when I got to 1950, I offered to become a Methodist minister. I'd never been in any other denomination, so I didn't even know any other. And in fact, my forefathers had been Methodists right back to John Wesley. One of his first preachers was John Pawson, a Yorkshire farmer, a direct ancestor of mine. And since then, everybody had either been farmers or preachers or both. So there was a family tradition, but it wasn't a tradition. It was my own decision and my life. So I offered to the Methodist Church for their ministry, and they said, well, we can't accept you for another year. Well, I said, I'll go anywhere you send me for a year and do anything you tell me for a year. So they said, right. I said, within the British Isles. So they said, right, you can go to the Shetland Islands, which was about as far away as they could get me, which I had always thought were in a kind of box in the Firth of Forth. And in every school atlas, they weren't up there. They were somewhere down here in a little square. And I set sail in a coal-fired ship from Leith, the port of Edinburgh, and we passed Aberdeen, we passed John O'Groats, we passed the Orkneys, we passed Fair Isle, and still we went on. I thought, where are these Shetland Islands? And finally finished up there, where I looked after 5 churches and had a motorboat to travel between them. And it was a wonderful experience. But the first funeral I had was, I think, the beginning of the burden which I'm sharing with you right now. We're back in 1950. It was the first funeral of a man. And up there, no women come to the funeral, only men. And for the first time, the church was crowded with men. Every Sunday, it was a lifeboat church, women and children first. You know what I mean? But now, for the first time, here was a church packed with men, which surprised me a little. And then we got to the cemetery. And at the cemetery, I went through the routine or the ritual and walked away from the grave. But after I walked away, the men stayed there and did something else, and I didn't quite spot what they did. So I made inquiries, and apparently it was a Freemason who had died, and all the lodge had turned up for the funeral and were doing something to say goodbye to the Mason whom we just buried. I knew nothing about Freemasonry at that point, but I inquired and said, why are you all Freemasons? Why are you all in lodge? Because none of them came to church. And they began to tell me why they joined. The main reason I discovered was that after World War II, they had come home and they missed all male company so much. And they looked around for a place where they could be one of the lads again, and found the lodge, and they'd all joined up. All the ex-forces men had joined up. And they told me what fellowship they got and what brotherhood it was and all the rest of it. They even said, you should join. We'll put you up if you're interested. And I nearly did. I'm very thankful that I didn't, because I know much more about it now. But they told me that it would help me in my career, which I found a little strange. But I have since discovered that there are churches in London that wouldn't have you as their minister unless you're on the square. But I didn't join up, and I'm glad about it now. But I want to say, before I say any more about this, that what I say, even though it's negative and critical, is said when, in a sense, with one arm tied behind my back. Because until the church provides a better brotherhood for men than the local lodge, then I feel I'm fighting, as I say, with one hand tied behind my back. But I've since discovered much more about it. And I believe it is a dangerous way for men to find brotherhood and fellowship, though many join for good motives and social reasons. In fact, they've now written a little booklet about me, which they've circulated, warning people against this dreadful man, David Pawson. It was written by the Dean of the Anglican Cathedral in Hong Kong, which is an interesting sidelight. But I've seen the fruits of some of these things. I was in a sports stadium not far from here, and an elderly couple came up to me after the meeting. He was a tall, soldierly-looking man. I would put them in their 70s, but she was in quite a bad state. She was bent over, she was shaking, her cheeks were sunken, and she looked quite ill. And the husband said to me, "Would you pray for my wife?" And he said, "She's been such a good wife to me for so many years, but can't bear to see her like this." I said, "Well, I don't like to pray for healing until I know what's wrong. What's wrong with her?" And he said, "That's the problem. The doctors can't find out." And I said, "Well, I don't like to pray until I know what I'm praying about, so I'll ask the Lord to tell me, and if he does, we'll go ahead." And I asked the Lord, and he did. I said to the man, "Are you a Freemason?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I don't go to the lodge much these days, but yes, I am." I said, "In the name of Jesus, go home, burn everything you've got connected with that, and your wife will be healed." And he said, "I don't know where everything is." And the wife said, "I do." Wives tend to be like that. It's quite irritating. If you ever lose anything, go to your wife and she'll say, "Where did you last have it?" And there it is. Anyway, they went home and they had the bonfire, and she was no better. They burned things in the backyard and there was no improvement. And he actually shouted up to the sky. He said, "God, that man said she'd be healed if we burned it. And we burned it, she's no better." And for the first time in his life, God spoke to him and said, "There's more in the garage." And they went to the garage and found some other stuff and put it on the bonfire. Came back the next night. Came to me after the meeting. I couldn't believe my eyes. The wife looked 10 years younger. The husband looked as if I'd given him £1 million. There's a boy of 14 lives near us, and he's a bedwetter. Can't go camping without taking a rubber sheet, which causes all sorts of taunting and teasing. And the parents have had him to doctors, psychiatrists, everything, and they can't cure this bedwetting. But a friend of mine went to tea there and said, "Is there Freemasonry in this family?" Yes, his grandfather's the Grand Master of the lodge. And my friend simply prayed about that. The boy hasn't wet the bed once since. Now, you can explain these things away if you wish. But a man came to me not long ago, a medical doctor, and he was shaking with fear as he sat in the chair. And I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I've just been inducted into the 33rd degree." And he said, "I found out we worship Lucifer." And he said, "I go to church." And he said, "I'm scared stiff." Well, we got that sorted out. I was in the Isle of Man and preaching in the theatre on the front at Douglas. And a man came up to me on the promenade and he said, "You David Pawson?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you the man who says you can't be a Christian and a Freemason?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'm both." He said, "I'll give you 2 minutes to prove to me that you can't be both. And if you can prove it to me in 2 minutes, I'll resign." What a lovely challenge. Well, I remember taking my watch off and I said, "I'm not going to talk to you about the 33rd degree and what you get up to at the top." I said, "I'm going to talk about one of the first oaths you took, one of the first promises you made, a bloody oath about what you would do to anybody who betrayed the secrets." And I said, "Jesus said that if you even wish anybody dead, you've begun to be a murderer. How about taking a bloody oath like that?" And he opened his mouth to say something and said, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say it's only words, it's only a bit of ritual, we don't mean it. I said in the same Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. Always mean what you say. That's a little neglected bit of the law of Christ that Christians don't always remember. But it's there. So I said, if you meant that oath, you were going against the Sermon on the Mount. If you didn't mean it, you were going against the Sermon on the Mount. And you say you're a follower of Jesus. Well, I have to say that he resigned that afternoon. And I did it in a minute and a half. It would cost him a lot because the Isle of Man is riddled with it, where all the tax exiles go and they do all their commerce in the lodge. It was going to cost him a lot in his business, but he resigned. Now let me finish this little bit where I began. It shows you I'm serious today. We're talking about serious things. I want to see in the church a brotherhood of men that beats that hollow, that has no secrets, that's in the light, and where the name of Jesus is central. And that's what Jesus meant the church to be, a brotherhood. It's why he chose 12 men to start it. It's amazing that we go for the women and children today, whereas Jesus, to build his church, went for men. And working men, most of whom worked with their hands. There was only one pen pusher among them. But he chose 12 ordinary working men, and he started a church that now numbers 1,500 million. When will we learn to do it Jesus' way? I'll tell you now what I hope will come out of today, that in every church represented here, there will begin a men's discipling program in that church. It worries me when I go to church after church and say, let me see your program of activities. And it's often quite a long list. There are things for babies, for playgroups, for the youth, for pensioners, women's coffee mornings. And I look in vain in 9 churches out of 10 for anything for men. And yet that was how Jesus began at the beginning. Well, now, I discovered that most churches had more women than men. In the last 2 parish churches I've preached in, it was 5 women to 1 man. And he looked as if he'd been dragged there. But the average of churches I've been in is 2.5 to 1. I don't mean there's half a woman there, but 5 to 2, in other words. It's the average. There are some that are a little better. But why is it that the church is so lacking in men and become what I call lifeboat churches, women and children first? Well, I began to ask why. I've always been someone who wanted to know why. I began it as a little boy. My parents got fed up with me. Why, Daddy? Why, Mummy? And I've never stopped being like that. And I want to know why things are as they are. And I began to ask, why is it that the churches seem so poor in men, on the men's side, remembering that in the Old Testament, when God wanted to find out the strength of the people of Israel, he said, count the men over 20 who are able to fight. And I use that as a rough and ready gauge. I'm invited to go in churches and look at them and see them as hopefully the Lord sees them and give them some counsel and advice. One of the first things I do is count the men over 20 who are fit to fight the battles of the Lord. And that gives you a very good idea as to the real strength. I make no apology for saying I believe the strength of any church is in its men. And that's why I've been concentrating on that. So why is there this lack? Well, from the Shetlands I went to college, studied theology in Cambridge, nearly lost my faith. Certainly lost my faith in the Bible, but didn't lose my faith in God. They taught us to read the Bible with a pair of scissors and cut it up and cut things out. But anyway, I managed to hold on to my faith and came back out. But again into these churches where it was largely women and children. Why? After a bit, the Methodist Church told me that they wanted me to be an evangelist. And they gave me a caravan and a mobile cinema van to pull it, and sent me off to the South Yorkshire coalfields. Now, this was before the days of King Arthur, but it was still pretty tough up there. And I went down the pits and into the pubs and clubs and tried to evangelize. And some came to the Lord. But after a year, I knew that I was not an evangelist. It's great to find out what you're not. And then you stop trying to be what you're not. Find out what God wants you to be and go after that. But don't try to be what he doesn't want you to be. That's a killer. And I meet too many Christians trying to do what God has given somebody else a job to do. And I knew that I'm not an evangelist. Mind you, I don't regret that year. I learned a great deal about myself. We did see conversions, and I got a wife out of it. So it wasn't wasted. But I was coming back to the caravan at the end of the year, and I said, Lord, I'm sure you don't want me to continue in this. Sure you got something else for me, but it's been a wonderful learning experience. Thank you for it. But what do you want me to do? And as clear as that, he said, there'll be a letter waiting in the caravan for you. I couldn't wait to get there. And I got to the caravan, opened the door, and there was one blue envelope on the floor. So I picked it up feverishly and opened it and had to sit down. At the top of the letter was the Royal Air Force crest. We are looking for a chaplain in the Royal Air Force. 9 men have applied for the vacancy, but we want to add your name to the list of interviewees. Are you willing? So I searched the caravan to see if there was another envelope somewhere. But there wasn't. And so I had to assume this was what God wanted me to do. The last thing, I'd never been in the forces. There was still conscription in my day, or national service, but if you were on a farm, you were exempt. Butter was more important than guns immediately after the war. So I'd never been called up, and didn't want to be. Anyway, I went down to London and was interviewed. I'll never forget that interview. It was a big room and a long table covered with a green cloth, and behind it sat officers of the Navy, Army and Air Force. Sorry, Royal Navy, Army and Royal Air Force. And in uniform. And one single chair in front of this table. I took one look through the door and thought, I'm not going in there. I shall always be grateful to the sergeant who was on duty at the door to see us in one by one. As I passed him, he whispered, imagine them in their underwear, sir. And I went in, and I saw them all in string vests, and I lost all my fear of them. I relaxed, I enjoyed it, and so they gave me the job. And they said, go immediately to the CME, the Central Medical Establishment in Holborn, and have a medical. I found myself going through a medical with aircrew. And I remember going into a room stark naked, not a stitch of clothing on, and there was a doctor in a white coat sitting behind a desk, and he looked up and he said, Padre, come on in. And I've been trying to figure out ever since. I thought, do I have a trademark around here? Now, this is a men's meeting, so I can tell you the rest of it. I happened to tell one of the other men having a medical what he'd said. And he said to me, well, at least he didn't say, come on in, Rabbi. Anyway, I'll leave that with you. So I went into another room, and this was a man saying, now I need to test your hearing. Repeat every word I say. Fish. I said, fish. Chips. I said, chips. No. I said, look, I'm going to be a chaplain. I can't say words like that. He said, you're in. And he signed the certificate. And I found myself facing a congregation of hundreds of men. And I had all my old sermons in my pocket. And they went off like a lead balloon. And I realized that I had been adapting myself to preaching to women and children. And most preachers in this country have done the same. And it's quite different talking to men. Men want it straight from the shoulder. They don't want pussyfooting. They don't want it dressed up in nice language. They want it, what are you saying? Even if I disagree with you, I want to know what you're really saying. Come on, out with it. And I had to throw my sermons away. And that 3 years in the RAF as a chaplain did wonders for me. Unfortunately, it's made me a little too blunt in speech, and I find that civilian churches tend to react against that from time to time. They don't like outspoken preachers, I've discovered. So I'm usually introduced as no stranger to controversy. And all that means is that I tell it as it is, and I speak it out. But I found that that's what men want, even if they come and disagree with you about it, because they want it straight. So those 3 years had a profound effect on my ministry, and I came back into civilian life determined that any church I was pastor of would have as many men as women in it. And that meant asking, why are they not there? And I came up with a number of reasons. Number one, 2 world wars robbed the churches of men. They went away to the war and they didn't come back. I don't mean those who died. I mean those who lived but didn't come back to church. They had seen things and done things that were quite incompatible with faith in a good God. They said, how can I believe in a good God after the mud and blood of the trenches of World War I? I was in a church in East London recently where before World War I they had a men's meeting on a Monday night of 1,000 men. And they influenced national politics. One speaker at that Monday night meeting caused the resignation of a cabinet minister the Tuesday morning. There were members of parliament in that meeting. That meeting spoke to the nation and was effective. I said to the church, do you have one now? No. When did it go? They said, well, we tried to revive it after World War I. We got up to about 20 or 30, and then it fizzled out. And that could be said of many, many churches. If you look at the war memorials in churches, have you noticed how many more names there are in World War I than World War II? That's because many men went from the church to World War I. Not so many went from the church to World War II. There'd been this drop. And World War II simply accelerated it. Well, it meant that World War I led to a gigantic social revolution in England that had never happened before. Never before had so many men gone to war. Of course, it was voluntary at first, later conscription came, but the manhood of England went to war. And therefore, for the first time, women were taking over men's responsibilities. The home was run by the women for 4 years in some cases. The factories were now full of women. The factory hands were female. It is no accident, of course, that they immediately demanded the vote at the same time. We're doing a man's job. Only men could vote up till then. We want the vote. Now, I'm not saying this is a good or a bad development. What I'm trying to communicate is a gigantic social revolution had taken place in the absence of the men. And we have not recovered from that. When the men came home exhausted from the war, they said virtually to their wives, you're doing a grand job, you just carry on. And from that day, most of the decisions in most homes in England are made by the wife, not the husband. The husband regards his responsibility as fulfilled when he brings the wages home Friday night. That's his bit done. And the wife has to make the major decisions. In many homes, it is the wife who has to budget the way the wages are spent, whereas the Bible puts that responsibility firmly on the man. Wives should not have to worry about money. It is the man's responsibility to make provision, adequate provision, and to budget. But in many homes I go to, the poor wife is struggling to balance payment on the telly and on the car and with the housekeeping and everything else. That is a burden she should not be carrying. But in most homes, she is the queen, so she rules. She reigns. In Wales, it's mam who does. In England, it's mum. But that was World War I. And so we have, how many years? 70 years to make up to get the men back to church. And it's an uphill battle. It's not easy. That's one reason. World War I and II took the men away and they did not come back. Second reason, and I'm speaking plainly today, is an effeminate clergy. Now, there are many reasons for this. Partly the job tends to attract that kind of men. Partly the selection process has that effect. And partly it is that once a man finds himself among women and children and having to thank the ladies for making the tea, he changes his style. A vicar in the South Coast said to me, "My church is full of old ladies of both sexes." And I wanted to say to him, and thinking it is as bad as saying it according to Jesus, but I thought that's because there's one in the pulpit. When he put on his white frock on Sunday and climbed into the pulpit, his gestures, his style was geared to all the retired ladies on the South Coast. Even though physically he was male, his manner of ministry was thoroughly feminine. And the average caricature of a vicar on television is feminine. A follower rather than a leader. They don't, I notice, do that with Catholic priests in films and TV plays. They certainly do it with Anglican vicars and Free Church ministers. There's an element of truth here. If you think I'm just talking through my hat, here is a recent cutting of a survey of Church of England ordinands, about a couple of hundred of them, no more. A survey of 155 male and 97 female Anglican ordinands revealed that women ordinands were no less tough-minded or stable than their male colleagues, and in key aspects the women had a characteristically masculine profile. Surprisingly, the men were typically introvert, shy, and feminine. That was the majority, of course. There are exceptions. And so the ministry of the church has not attracted men's men for the most part. And the selection process has gone for safe rather than risky people. And one of the characteristics of masculinity is the willingness to take risks and to stick your neck out. But of course, that's always a threat to a system. And also the fact that ministering to women and children for most of the time affects a person. I was sitting in a family service with my wife recently, and I'm going to caricature so that you recognize, but this is nearly what happened. The dear man preaching, this is the sermon. He said, "Now," he said, "can anyone tell me anything about a man called Daniel?" And there was dead silence in the congregation. Nobody answered. Said, come on, anybody? No? And a little housewife in the front row with a row of babies in pushchairs in front of her. I don't know if they were all hers or not, but she raised a hand and she said, "I think I know." He said, "Yes? What do you know about Daniel?" And she said, "He pulled a thorn out of a lion's paw." Now, I'm glad you laughed at that. You must know that that's an old Greek legend about a man called Androcles. But anyway, she tried. And the dear preacher said, "Good try, not quite right, but good try. Anybody else?" Nobody else. "Well, I'll have to tell you," he said, "Daniel was thrown into a fiery furnace." Well, I'm glad more of you laughed then. I'd begun to think you didn't know your Bible. But anyway, my wife dug me in the ribs and just whispered, "The blind leading the blind," and we began to giggle. But I looked around at the men at that point, and they were either checking to see that they had the same colored socks on, or they were studying the electric light fittings. They were thoroughly embarrassed. It was supposed to be a family service, but there was nothing for men in it. The sermon was treating us all like a Sunday school class. Do you follow me? And those men looked as if they couldn't wait to get out and have a fag. No, they were just totally out of their setting and context. Well, this is the second major reason I came to realize an effeminate clergy, and the clergy produces the church. The one problem with being a minister or a vicar or a pastor is that people follow you. Of course, you say you want that. Actually, they don't follow what you say, they follow what you do and what you are. A third reason is that it's much easier for women to become Christians than men. And I want to explain why. Every woman in her heart is looking for a man to whom she can entrust her life. Someone she can trust to protect her, to provide for her, to do what she needs. Someone to look up to honor and obey. Every woman is looking for such a man. And of course, when they find Jesus, they have found the perfect man. It is almost natural for them to respond to Jesus, especially if they're in a bad marriage or if they're a single mother. They respond so readily to finding a man that they can trust. Now, we men are rather different. We have a cast iron muscle in the back of our necks. We like to be independent. We don't want to admit we need help from anybody. We'll battle through even if it kills us. Our independence is part of our masculinity. And so to become a Christian, a man has to do two things which are against his nature. First, he's got to come and accept Jesus because he needs him. And the man's instincts say, I don't need any help. I can manage my own life. As a man said to a friend of mine, he said, do you expect me to come before the Lord and with open hands and arms and confess my life's a failure and I can't manage without him? He said, I'm damned if I will. And you can guess what my friend said to him. He just quietly said, you'll be damned if you don't, which is the truth. But he was expressing this male independence, and especially between 20 and 45, provided we've got our health and strength, we can manage our own life. Thank you. We don't need anybody to tell us what we should be doing. Unless a major disaster comes. Unless we are found out in crime like Jonathan Aiken, who's now become a Christian. People say, well, that's because he was found out. Yes, it was because he was found out. And he found himself out and realized what he really was like, that even though he went to church, he was an arrogant, self-confident, independent man who wasn't trusting Jesus. Well, thank God it has brought him. But it takes a disaster, AIDS, a failed business, a partner who's run off with the funds, a broken marriage. Between 20 and 45, it usually takes a pretty big disaster to tell a man he needs help. And then once he's trusted Christ and in a sense taken a feminine part towards Christ, he's now part of the bride of Christ, looking to Christ as his husband. He then has to do another somersault against his nature and remain a masculine man. Too many Christians surrendering to Christ, Christian men surrendering to Christ, become wimps. They become more feminine. In relationship to Christ, a man must become more feminine. In relationship to other people, he needs to remain masculine. Towards his family, towards his colleagues, towards everybody else. Now that's quite an adjustment. It's a double somersault for a man to make, and it's only the grace of God that can help him to do it. But too many men have lost their manhood when they became Christians. And that's a tragedy. I think you know what I'm talking about. Well, let me illustrate this by saying I went down to Wales, South Wales. A woman came up to me after the meeting and she said, Mr. Pawson, I've got a problem. Will you help me with it? I said, have you got a husband as well as a problem? She said, yes. I said, is your husband the problem? She said, no. Then I said, have you been to your husband with the problem? She said, no. I said, why not? Well, she said, it's a spiritual problem and he's not a Christian. And I said, what difference does that make? And she said, well, don't you understand? He hasn't the first understanding of spiritual things. And this is a spiritual problem. I said, but your husband is the man that God wants you to go to with it. She said, I can't believe that. I said, God wants to answer your problem through your husband. That's why he gave you your husband. She said, well, I just can't believe it. I said, listen, God once spoke to a man through his donkey. And you are saying that God can't speak through your husband. Now that convinces 9 out of 10 women, which tells me what they think of their husbands. But she wasn't convinced. And she went away. And she spread rumors all over the place. Don't go to David Pawson with a spiritual problem. He doesn't understand what it's like being married to an unbeliever. And she did a lot of damage to my reputation. Nevertheless, a year later, I'm in the same place, and she's coming again, and she says, I've got another problem, Mr. Pawson, and this time it is my husband. So I can't go to him with it. So I said, what's your problem this time? She said, what do you do with a husband who's way ahead of you spiritually? And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I was angry with you for a couple of months because you wouldn't help me. And she said, I tried to get help elsewhere and nobody would help me. In desperation, I said to my husband, could you help me with a problem? And he gave me the answer. And she said, I don't know who was more surprised, him or me. But she said, from that day, he began to be interested in spiritual things. And now he's a Christian and I can't keep up with him. He's so keen. He's so enthusiastic. He's way up here. She said, I can't cope. And I said, you know your problem. You wanted your husband just where you were. You didn't like him back here. You don't like him up here. You want him just there. Well, it's your job as wife to be where he is. He's your head. You see, I believe that a Christian wife should still regard her unbelieving husband as her spiritual head. But wives usually come to Christ before husbands, and that creates a problem. It can break a marriage up. A lady came to Christ in our village, and the vicar was so excited. He had her giving testimonies at meetings and all over the place, his first trophy, you know. Her husband in the pub was telling people, Jesus ran off with my wife. Any wife who becomes a Christian first needs to be told very quickly, don't preach. Don't spend all your days in church. The Bible says you've got to win your husband without a word by becoming more attractive to look at and more attractive to live with. And when your husband feels he's got a better wife from Jesus, he's going to get interested. That's 1 Peter chapter 3 if you're interested. The Bible's very practical. You see, it is easier. It's the easiest for children to be brought to faith in Christ. If you love them and they trust you, it's so easy to get a child to talk to Jesus. Wives, women generally are the second easiest. Men are the toughest. So that's why the church has concentrated on Sunday schools and women's meetings. But Jesus started with men. And I believe we should relearn to do it his way. And if I had all my time over again, my first priority as a pastor of a church would be to disciple men. That would be my very first priority. All other things would become secondary to that. Because if you get the men, the women and children will follow. If you get the women and children, you can drive the man further and further away. If his wife has become a spiritual racehorse while he's still at the starting post, you're driving a wedge in that marriage. I have told more than one wife, when she's asked me, what can I do to get my husband saved? I've said, stop going to church. They always say, no, seriously, what should I? I said, I was serious. And in so many cases, it has worked. Because you see, the wife has found it so easy to give her life to Jesus, whatever kind of a husband she has. The husband finds it more difficult to sense his need. Well, now these were some of the reasons that gave me a burden for men. But I also was developing the same burden for men from what was happening out there in society. And while I have been in the ministry, there has been a gender revolution. It began in the 60s with something called unisex. And I remember years ago I was going to Singapore, and therefore I needed to get my hair cut first. I presume you know why. There's a law in Singapore against men's hair touching their collar. It's the way they dealt with antisocial elements in their city. And so, since my hair was touching my collar, I had to go and get a haircut. So I said to my wife, I'm going into town. And she said, I've got to go in too. Can I come with you? So we parked the car and went our separate ways. And I found, in those days, a hairdresser that didn't need appointments. And I walked in. But as I walked in, I noticed this word unisex. And inside, I found both young men and young women doing the hairdressing, and men and women clients. So I sat down and in a chair, and an extremely attractive young lady started cutting my hair. A new experience for me, not unpleasant. And so I was chatting away, and I looked in the mirror and saw on the other side of the room my wife with a young, smart, handsome Italian cutting her hair. And neither of us had known we were going to the same place, and we just saw each other. We exploded. We just roared with laughter. I don't know what the staff thought, but it seemed so ludicrous. But it was the thin end of a wedge. Men began to get their hair much longer. Women began to cut it shorter, the Grace Jones look. Men began to wear earrings and jewelry and carry handbags. Women began to wear jeans and jackboots. There was confusion. It reached the point where one vicar finished a wedding service by saying, I now pronounce you to be husband and wife and leave you to find out the difference. That was the beginning of a confusion between male and female, which has accelerated ever since. And now we do not know where we are. I believe behind it was not just a social trend. I believe Satan, whose other name is Apollyon, the destroyer, and who can't create anything, so finds his joy in destroying what God has created. He is the original vandal. I believe Satan is destroying male and female, quite deliberately, because God put chivalry and romance. Chivalry has now been labeled chauvinism. I've been rebuked for letting a lady go through the door first. And our whole sense of values about gender has been distorted. Now let me say straight away about the trend we call feminism, that there is a legitimate complaint behind it, that women have been treated as second-class citizens and of unequal value to men. That is the right complaint, and we need to hear it as men, because we've all been guilty of it in some way or another. However, the solution proposed is the wrong solution, and that is to obliterate all differences, call us all persons, and to become politically correct. Politically correct is far from being biblically correct. And there is an increasing tension here. There are Christians who are more concerned about being politically correct than morally correct. Well, let me trace this development over the last few years. 60s, the age of unisex. 70s, the age of homosex. Came out of the closet. It was now legal. And what becomes legal becomes all right. That's a very important principle, that when anything is recognized legally, it is accepted by the population as right. That has implications for legalizing drugs and legalizing prostitution and many other political causes. Anyway, homosexuality came out of the closet. I remember at one meeting, and you will never know who this is, a young man came up to me and he said, David, can you help me? I hate myself. And I looked at him handsome, well-dressed, well-spoken, obviously well-educated, good job in the City of London, everything a young man could ask for. And I said, yet you hate yourself. I said, why? He said, because every spare minute I have in London, I walk the streets looking for a man to have sex with. And I'm just disgusted with myself. I said, are you a Christian? He said, yes, I am. Or I try to be. And he certainly believed in the Lord. I said, when did this start? He said, at school, at boarding school. Now, I know what goes on at boys' boarding schools. Would never send a boy of mine to a boarding school, but never mind. I said to him, no, it didn't start then. It started years before that, in your home, in your family. He said, I don't think so. I said, tell me about your parents. He said, what do you want to know? I said, who was boss? Your dad or your mum? Oh, he said, mum. In fact, he said she'd already ditched 2 husbands before she married my father. And she bossed him. I said, tell me, when you fell down and hurt yourself, who did you run to for comfort? He said, Dad. I said, did your dad hug you and kiss you? Yes. I said, that's good. Dad should. But I said, did your mum? Never. I said, one more question. I said, did you ever climb into bed with your dad? Yes, many times. And I said, and what happened to him? And suddenly it all came out. His dad was not having good relations with his mum. And when the boy got into bed, he got sexually excited, and you can guess the rest. I could have wept for that boy. And I found in so many cases that a man whose sexuality is confused, invariably you will find that dad was not the father, the head of the house. Mum was. If there was a dad at all. And so the boy grows up with confused emotions, treating his dad as a mum and his mum as a dad, or not having a dad at all, and the poor mum is trying to be dad as well as mum. And we are reaping a harvest today of all this, which will go on and get worse and worse, until men are true fathers, heads of their house, and leading their wives and families, not dictating to them, but leading them. We're going to have an increase in this perversion. And the Bible does call it that. It is an abomination to God. He never intended. He didn't build our bodies for it. The back passage is too delicate to be used for that. But that's what's happening. And then came the 70s. And bisexual and transsexual were the next stage in the process. I remember one day my secretary, a lovely lady, always cool, calm and collected, came into my office in hysterics. And I said, whatever's the matter? And she finally said, there's somebody waiting to see you and I just can't cope. So I went through to the outer office, and here was a middle-aged woman with a hat and coat and a handbag sitting in a chair. And I sat down beside her and said, what's the trouble, dear? She said, I'm so worried about my wife and children. I did a kind of double take. And we had 3 psychiatrists in the church, and I wondered if one of them might be free to come and give me a hand. But then I realized this person was perfectly sane. I noticed the hands. They were twice the size of mine. Great, big, tough hands. I said, I think you better tell me. I was a gunner in the Royal Navy, was the next remark. I could see by the hands. Came out of the Navy, went home, couldn't stand life at home with the wife and kids, ran away from home to London, got into bad company, got into kinky sex, began to dress as a woman, finally had the operation, penis removed and hormone treatment, and was now a woman. And still got so depressed that this person went to the Thames embankment to throw themselves in the river. And there is an evangelist who goes walking up and down the embankment, stopping suicides and giving them gospel tracts. And stopped this person, gave him a tract, made them say the sinner's prayer, and then said, now I'll give you a name and address of someone who will help you, and gave my name and address. And they arrived. This was actually back in the 70s, early 70s, but it was the first time I'd had a pastoral situation like that. Looked at all my books on counselling, not one of them mentioned this. Thought of all my training at Cambridge, they never came within a million miles of telling me how to handle this. It took 6 months to get that person straight. I had to say, you must not go back to your wife and children. That's just going to confuse them further. To find a job for them was almost impossible. I went round employer after employer, begging them to take this person on. But when they found out that here was a person using women's toilets with a man's mind and memory, they didn't want to know. And finally, I got a Christian employer to take them on. Gradually and slowly but surely. You ever thought about how to help a person to realize who they are in Christ when they've already had an irreversible sex change? Think about it. How do they discover what God intended them to be? That was the first, but I'm afraid it was far from the last. I'm told there are now 25,000 such people in England. That's the population of a small town. You can get it free on the National Health Service, and they've even done a series of TV programs on how to do it. I was talking to a couple at a cocktail party in London. I said, what are your jobs? And the man said, I'm a surgeon, my wife's a psychologist. I said, oh, you look after body and soul, as a kind of joke, you know. They said, that's just what we do. We have our own private clinic. And I said, what kind of people come there? Oh, people who want to change sex. And he said, I change their bodies and my wife changes their minds. I said, do you have many customers? We've got a waiting list of hundreds. We're living in a funny world. A world in which people don't want to accept what God has made them. A world in which they want to say, I will choose what I want to be. Most of the men I've counseled, and some I've managed to persuade not to go ahead with it, have been men who wanted to be looked after rather than the responsibility of looking after anyone else. That's what I've discovered. They want to be a woman and have a man to look after them, rather than face up to the responsibilities of being a man under God. Well, that's been society's trend, and this gave me a burden to help men to be men. Not that I count myself a model for manhood, but nevertheless, I have that burden to help men to be men before God, to be what God meant them to be. So we have many women now in men's spheres. Almost at random, I've got a whole lot of cuttings here I've collected over the last few years. This is one of the biggest changes. Women now use guns and drop bombs. The Gulf War was the first, but now it's normal for women to kill. It's only 3 or 4 years since the British forces ceased to put men only in the fighting line. That's a gigantic change. Our grandfathers would have been absolutely astonished at the development. Boxing, wrestling. There's a whole debate about boxing at the moment, but it will open up. Women want to do everything men can do. Not many of them are asking to go down the coal mines yet. There's the champion arm wrestler. It's a woman. And it was in an Australian newspaper that was really attacking me for speaking against feminism. So above the article, really gunning for me in the newspaper, was this picture of this champion arm wrestler. We're still not at the end of the trend. It was Oscar Wilde who was asked by a lady at a dinner, what is the essential difference between you as a man and me as a woman? He said, Madam, I cannot conceive which was a typical Oscar Wilde cliche. Nevertheless, that is now obsolete. When I was in Paris, I talked to some doctors, and they said, we have found it is possible to impregnate a man. And I heard a couple talking, and the husband was saying to his wife, you've had 3 children. If you have any more, 2 children. If you have any more, it'll ruin your figure. I don't want you to have any more. I'm going to have the next one. And in any case, I want the experience. Now, I thought, are we talking about fantasy? No. You probably know that a female egg leaving the ovary, going down the fallopian tube, can miss the womb and can attach itself to the abdomen. It's pregnancy outside the womb. There's a technical term for it we won't go into. 1 or 2 of you may have been such cases. Of course, there's no way out for the baby at the end of 9 months because it's attached to the abdomen. It has to be delivered by cesarean operation. And so these French doctors said, what if we put a fertilized egg in a male abdomen? Would it attach itself and develop a placenta against the man's abdomen wall? And it did. It went for about 2 months, and then the body rejected it. And they're now working for the kind of drugs that stop bodies rejecting kidneys and hearts from other people, so that they can take a man to full pregnancy, and men can choose to be mothers. The result of all this is going to be, by the way, that was a spoof advertisement a few years ago. If you had to carry the baby, you men, that's going to come true. Well, the possibility now is that families will be completely indifferent to gender. I mean by that, you could be living with your wife and children in a house here, and in the house next door, both parents and all children are female. And in a house next door on the other side, both parents and all children are male. And again, we're not talking about science fiction. Here's the photograph of the first all-female family in Britain, with insemination of fertilized babies, with the ability to find out early in pregnancy the gender of the fetus. You can choose now. And many parents, I fear, are choosing abortion because the fetus is not the sex they wanted. That is happening. And so here you have the first all-female family. What is happening to God's intention to create male and female? And finally, let me add that the confusion has now got right inside the church. And that's my biggest burden. It's one thing for society to rebelling against God's ordering of our lives, but for the church to join in. I believe the church, and that means Christian men to me, Christian men ought to be leading society uphill rather than following society downhill. But it seems to me that the church follows the world only 15 years later. So we get a reputation for being old-fashioned and behind the times because we are reluctant to go down the road. The world accepted homosexuality 20 years ago. The church is now just beginning to accept it. That's the kind of lag that there is. And Christians just slowly follow the world downhill. Divorce is becoming as frequent within the church as it was outside 20 years ago. And so the church goes slowly downhill, dragging its feet after everybody else, but gradually adapting to current mores and standards, whereas it should be leading the world uphill. Now, these are not horror stories. I'm just setting a scene. There is now a new Bible, officially produced by the major denominations in America, called the Inclusivist Version, in which all sexism, quote, has been removed. Jesus is no longer son of man. He is child of human being. God is no longer father. He is father, mother. And the whole Bible has been retranslated and altered quite deliberately, and it's officially the Bible of the whole major denominations. It's not yet got over here, but it's coming. A review of that in the New York Herald Tribune, I think. A reviewer said this, and I thought it was one of the wittiest and cleverest remarks I'd heard. He said, "The devil must be laughing her head off." Now, that isn't just a joke, because in the inclusivist version, the devil is still male, which rather gives the game away, doesn't it? It is sheer prejudice. The BBC morning service is now praying to Mother in heaven. I wrote a letter to them, and I've got the reply from the BBC. We have had very few objections, and we have to reflect current trends in our religious services. So pray to God, she'll help you. I could take you to an Anglican cathedral where they've installed a new crucifix above the high altar. It is life-size. It was sculpted by Sir Winston Churchill's granddaughter by the name of Soames. On it, the figure of Christ is totally nude. That is as it should be. That little bit of cloth draped around his private parts is just not true to crucifixion. The humiliation of it was to be stuck up there stark naked, but the church of the Middle Ages didn't want people to know that Jesus was circumcised and a Jew. But that's another story. But on this crucifix I'm talking about, today's crucifix, not only is Jesus life-size and totally nude, he is totally female. And this is hanging above the altar. Men have told me that they often have trouble with wrong thoughts when they come to communion. It seems if coming to Holy Communion, the devil tries to rob you of the holiness of it by putting a wrong thought in your mind. Can you imagine kneeling down in front of a naked female figure when you take the bread and wine? Well, this is happening. And if you don't realize it, then open your eyes. The utter confusion between male and female has spread right into the church now. And we have it to face inside. The whole question of the ordination of women was simply the tip of the iceberg. I predicted then that the next decision would be the ordination of homosexuals. And I'm not going to tell you what I predict will follow that, because it is all part of a mood in which the church is accepting the spirit of the age rather than asking the Holy Spirit to be the leader. So I think you've got the burden. Our society needs strong families and a strong church, and both need strong men. A bishop has written a little poem which I'll quote in conclusion. Where the warfare is fiercest in the battlefields of life, there you'll find the Christian soldier represented by his wife. He's got something. Well, let me tell you what we're going to do the rest of the day. In the second talk, I want to talk about the differences between male and female, which God made and intended. I've discovered that men don't know the difference between men and women. Isn't that astonishing? Let me make an offer right now. When I have told you of the differences between men and women, all you have to do is to come and tell me that you knew all that, and you can gladly have a free copy of any one of my books off the bookstore. There's an offer for you. I have to warn you that I haven't lost a book yet, even with doctors present. Nevertheless, I make that offer freely again. If you tell me I knew all that, I know the difference between men and women, you take a free book with my blessing. And I'm ready for a cup of coffee, and I'll bet you are too.
You have been listening to David Pawson's podcasts. Other talks in this series and other free teaching resources can be downloaded free of charge by visiting www.davidpawson.co.uk.